What in the heck's going on? Hello and welcome to another episode of Not So Super Movie Reviews. Today we're going to be talking about the movie Jonah Hex, which is actually based on a 1970s comic from DC about a Wild West bounty hunter with some supernatural abilities. This movie had a critic score of 12 and a user review score of 20. So the critics hated it and the users also hated it. So let's dive in and we'll see if I also hated it. First, let's say something nice about this movie. And, right off the bat, I think it's based on a really interesting premise. And where it tried to tap into that premise, it does work at times. And that premise is, this Wild West bounty hunter badass who can bring people back to life to speak with them. He can bring them back from hell and just for a minute to talk to them in a pretty traumatizing way. But that is actually a pretty decent premise. I mean, a bounty hunter that can use the dead. It's like Sixth Sense meets, uh, you know, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Which, like I said, as a premise, like on paper, that sounds amazing. Now, this movie maybe didn't do so hot with that premise, but those times where he's bringing people back to life, you wish they had used that to more creative effect. But I do have to admit that was a pretty decent starting point. The second thing that I feel like they got right was casting Josh Brolin as the badass supernatural bounty hunter. That just makes sense to me. Now, obviously, he's been in some bigger roles since then that help us to see him in this role now. I'm thinking of Agent K and Men in Black 3, Thanos, obviously, Cable in Deadpool 2. Regardless of what you thought about Deadpool 2, he made a great Cable, I thought. So, yeah, I mean, casting Josh Brolin as your lead for this role for Jonah Hex totally makes sense. I mean, with the scarred face and just the whole Wild West gruff bounty hunter, totally buy it 100%. The third thing I liked about this movie is really more of an honorable mention, and that's just the action. There's a lot of really good action scenes in this movie, and watching the sharpshooting, it does work at times, even when it is kind of silly where he's got Gatling guns connected to his horse. Even during those scenes, it's still pretty cool to watch. And the choreography for the fight scenes I thought was actually pretty good. Unfortunately, that's about everything that I actually liked about this movie. So let's get into what actually didn't work about this movie. And the first thing is the casting from pretty much everyone else. You've got some pretty decently big names. John Malkovich as the villain was just underwhelming. And his, the southern accents in this movie, just across the board, are pretty lackluster. At times it seems like he's going for a southern accent, and at other times it seems like he's not. It just feels like he just doesn't play a very threatening or over the top villain. You don't really connect with him as a threat in the movie. At least I didn't. So as much as I love John Malkovich, this was definitely a weak point. You've also got Will Arnett, who plays a Union general. Megan Fox, we could spend the rest of this video harping on Megan Fox. That between the acting, just her character in general was mostly pointless. And her accent was just atrocious.
Always do like when you finally show up.
I mean, just on again, off again, really not hitting the mark. Michael Fassbender, actually, he's an honorable mention. It wasn't terrible. He plays this Irish thug.
Daddy!
Don't do this, no!
The second thing is not such a big deal, but it is noticeable, and it's just the Wild Wild West style retro futurist sort of thing where they're trying to put more futuristic technologies into an Old West story, which I thought was really stupid. I love Wild Wild West for what it is, but in this movie it made even less sense because it only does it in random weird places. Like he's got some dynamite launching guns and They have this giant ship with like city destroying bombs on it, with these like futuristic orange orbs that detonate the bombs. It just feels really out of place. And with such an interesting premise of this bounty hunter that can speak to the dead, you didn't need it. And so they didn't really lean into it, but it's there. And it was pretty much useless. This whole story could have been exactly the same through some other device besides inserting these technologies that just couldn't exist at the time, to be frank. The last thing that doesn't work about this movie, and it is painfully obvious, and it's definitely the number one thing holding this movie back, is just that it's got a very simple story. It's a very surface level, tortured hero versus evil villain story. His family is killed by the villain, so he wants revenge. The villain, he's evil, so obviously he wants to blow people up. He kills all the people that help him for no reason. Why do people keep helping him if he kills them anyway? At the last second, the hero prevails through astronomical odds. For a movie with a guy who can talk to dead people and futuristic machinery set in the Wild West, there's got to be something more interesting you can do with that than just hero versus villain. But there really isn't much more to this movie than exactly that. All right, so who was right? The critics or the users? And actually, for this one, I'm going to have to give it my own score of 40%. The reason I want to give it a 40% is because, yes, this is not a great movie. But to me, 12 and 20 doesn't say, it was all right. It says, this movie is garbage. And to me, it wasn't garbage. It just wasn't great. The redeeming quality of this movie is that it's not very long. It's only around an hour and a half. And so even though it's got a simple story and some not so good elements, the story is always moving forward. And there's plenty of action throughout that story, keeping you entertained. Honestly, by the end of that hour and a half, I was like, oh, is it over? And a lot of these older superhero movies or some of these bad superhero movies are just boring to watch. They just takes forever to watch them. This one, I didn't feel that. I didn't feel like it dragged on. I felt like it didn't do anything for me, beyond that, but it also didn't punish me for watching it. And honestly, I would recommend you give it a watch if you like watching bad superhero movies like I do, because it's a really easy watch. It's only an hour and a half, and like I said, there are some redeeming elements, and Josh Brolin is great. And so I think I'm a lot more comfortable with the 40, which says, yes, this is a bad movie, but it's not the worst movie ever made. Alright, thanks for checking out another episode. Make sure you like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video and you want to see more like it. If you have a suggestion for a movie I can do next on my channel, it's got to be 65% or less on Rotten Tomatoes. Today's video was actually based on a request from user Resident Fiend, so absolutely I do read those comments. Let me know if there's a movie you'd like to see, and if not, we'll see you next time.